Nancy leads the IBM's Global Business Services for the public sector in the province of Ontario. And as a result, she has a leadership role in provincial, regional, municipal governments, agencies, boards, commissions, education, healthcare, transportation, not-for-profit organizations, and I don't know whether I've forgotten anything here, but a very widespread on the public sector. She's led some of the largest and most successful consulting, system implementations, and business operation programs in the public sector, and has worked with government on healthcare, transportation, and not-for-profits. One interesting thing I found when I was looking at Nancy is that she actually is a graduate of the University of Guelph, and I am too, so there you go. She was in agriculture, and I was in the old home economics program, which became the family and consumer studies program. So we sort of, I think, moved a little bit away from what our original education was. As a result, she's very involved with the Ontario 4-H Foundation and is treasurer of Farm Radio International, which is a charitable organization that uses radio to provide education to rural families in Africa. And we had Keith yesterday, who was on the board or the chair of Build Africa. So it seems that there is a lot of interest being spent in Africa, maybe being the solution to some of our problems. So please welcome Nancy to the podium. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I think perhaps what you've just proven is that you can never take the farm out of the girl. So my rural roots continue in some of the charity work and other things I do. Actually, my original roots in agriculture were focused on public policy in the sense that it was agriculture and food policy. In the days in the 70s and 80s when I first started into that, we were very focused, of course, on international trade, and that was in many ways the beginning of a lot of the globalization that we see today. I'm going to be talking about capitalizing on complexity, which is the theme we've been focused on throughout the sessions here. But before I get into the results of this major CEO survey that we did worldwide and in Canada and talk to you about those results, I thought I'd take a few minutes to talk about another part of complexity that we're working on in IBM. And I thought it was fairly serendipitous that a little earlier you were asking for the Jeopardy theme music. And how many here are Jeopardy fans? We got some Jeopardy fans out here. Well, you've got to watch Jeopardy next week, because next week IBM's brand new computer Watson, named after our original founder, Watson, will be playing on Jeopardy. And this is a very, very big and exciting new development we've been working on for 3 years on the complexity of human language. And our scientists started thinking about the next stage in computing and the ability to solve some of the biggest problems in the world, many of those in public sector, how to take the initiatives around areas such as health, how to really do diagnostics, how to solve analytics and data by not being just analyzing numbers or keywords, but truly being able to understand the syntax of human language. And they were sitting around a room brainstorming on how they would go about this, and the idea that if they could create a computer that could win at Jeopardy, they could truly move the ball very significantly. So I've got a video here for a few minutes that I thought you might enjoy seeing just on what's been happening with that initiative, and then I'll fill you a bit more in on how to watch it.
We were mainly interested in using Jeopardy as a playing field upon which we could do some science. We wanted the ability to use questions that had not been designed for a computer to answer.
Jeopardy really represents natural language. You have to understand the English language and all the nuances and all the regionalisms and the slang and the shorthand to play the game, to get the clues. It's not just a piece of information.
This name of a boy who can fly can be applied to any emotionally undeveloped man. Christian?
What is Peter Pan?
Right.
Because of the nature of the game, it's going to drive the technology in the right directions. It's got the broad domain aspect, asks all kinds of things, which is one of the challenges we really wanted to take on. It had the confidence aspect. Don't answer if you don't think you're right. You also had to do it really quickly, and we all knew that to make a technology work, it's got to be responsive. It had all the right elements to make a really good challenge to drive question answering.
The rate of growth of information is surpassing our ability to understand it and extract knowledge from it. We decided that we needed to build a system that could extract knowledge at a much faster rate from enormous amounts of data than human beings or any other computer system can do.
Watson, you control the board. Go ahead.
I Love Lucy for 800.
It was Ricky's signature tune and later the name of his club. Watson.
What is Song?
No.
At the very beginning, there was a version of a system that would take questions and come back with answers, and it was terrible.
It's a no-brainer that this Nobel laureate and Secretary of State was made an honorary Globetrotter in 1976. Watson.
What is Nobel Peace Prize?
No.
Didn't have a good notion of what's the answer type. What's the question even asking for? That shows a problem with question answering systems in that you work really hard on one domain of questions and then you pick up this great thing that you've built and you go apply it to a new domain and it just completely falls down.
Our team looked at this and said, you know what, we've got incredible capability here. We can pull together the people that understand the language, understand the supercomputing, and we might be able to really move the needle in deep Q&A.
In the very beginning, one of my perspectives was, if you think this cannot be done, you're just not going to work with an open enough and ambitious mindset that's going to move you forward. So I was really looking for people who were willing to say, I have an idea, I think we can get there from here.
And I remember the first integration run. We were putting all these scores together, and the answer came out, and we had made this big jump. We had jumped like 10%. And I was like, aha, there's something to this. There's something to this idea of putting more features into the system, letting a lot of algorithms take a shot at it, and then learning which algorithms am I going to trust? How am I going to merge all this evidence together?
The closing of the epiglottis over the vocal cords produced the sound of this. Watson.
What is hiccup?
Hiccup is correct.
I remember when we crossed the 50% you need in order to be making positive money on Jeopardy. Everyone was really excited, but then there was a new line, which was, okay, well, what do we need to become competitive with a good Jeopardy player? So then there was another line that we were trying to get closer and closer to get. And then eventually we got very close to that. And then there was another line, which was, well, how do the grand champions play?
So, Carrie, you're in the first position. You choose first and start us off.
Curses for 200.
Curses 200.
When we were first approached, we thought, well, this is interesting. But I think our major concern was, how do we keep from this becoming a stunt or a gimmick?
You got to know when to hold 'em, know when to fold 'em. On July 28, 1994, this Texas Ranger with a familiar name did. Watson?
What is Kenny Rogers?
That is correct. Select again, Watson.
But this was different. This was the notion of knowledge acquired by a computer against knowledge acquired and displayed by the best Jeopardy players.
What is Oakland Athletics?
That is correct.
This could be something important, and we want to be a part of it.
Many people are going to watch the Jeopardy show and look at Watson and how it competes in Jeopardy and the curiosity of the computer.
Here we go in 10, 9, 8.
They'll focus on man versus machine. But the more interesting general challenge is we are trying to produce a deep question and answering machine which will change the way people interact with computers and machines.
This is Jeopardy!
We're going to revolutionize, I think, many, many fields.
And now, here is the host of Jeopardy, Alex Trebek.
So for those who are interested, on Wednesday this week, Wednesday evening, on WNEB Public Television in the U.S., there will be a documentary that goes a bit further into understanding what is going on with the complexity of that Watson computer and the analytics that it's able to provide. And then beginning next week, for 3 days, Watson will be playing the two greatest Jeopardy champions, and you can enjoy watching that and seeing the outcomes of the complexity challenge that IBM is undertaking through Watson. The winnings of the Watson computer on Jeopardy are going to be donated to World Vision or to the World Community Grid. Are anyone here familiar with World Community Grid? If you aren't, you should take a chance to look at. This is one of the easiest charitable things you can do. Just go into your search engine, put in World Community Grid, and what you do is sign up to allow the computing power on your computer to be used for research activities, many of them to support causes in the developing world when you're not using it. My computer sits, and when it's on my desk, every once in a while it gets taken over and it's doing research on rice for India, and then another time it's doing research on cancer, and it actually provides the computing power to scientists. So that's something you might want to look at. And Watson's job, or where one of the first places we wish to take this complex computing power, is into the public sector space. I think that's really fascinating that this work is going to go immediately into public sector, and that is to look at the areas of healthcare and health analytics and health diagnostics. So watch for that next week. So let me take a few minutes and introduce our Capitalizing on Complexity CEO survey. IBM has been undertaking the CEO surveys. We've done 4 over the past 6 years, and they have become increasingly large in the sample size that we've worked with. And the most recent one, we had over 1,500 CEOs around the world participate in this. They were one-on-one, face-to-face interviews with a very extensive complex questionnaire. This was not just a simple rating and ranking, but it also involved a large amount of analysis of quotes and comments made by the individuals. Our definition of CEO is both private sector and public sector. So the sample size that was included in this for Canada involved 53 respondents, and about 1/2 of those, 48% to be specific, were from the public sector. So the public sector would be defined as if that was a provincial government, for example, a secretary of cabinet. It could be the head of a major healthcare institution, a hospital, or a major education institution, transportation or public transportation organization, etc. You'll see the breakout both worldwide there in terms of the organizations and the geography that we had in our CEOs. CEOs in the survey, I think a couple of things that are important to understand about the analytics that were done in the survey. First of all, it is weighted based on the actual GDP of different geographic regions. So this is a balanced survey, so you don't have a small country being overweighted in the results relative to a larger country, just depending on where the CEOs were interviewed. It's also done in-depth analysis on the financials. As I go through it, you'll see some grouping of organizations. One of the things, unfortunately, we have not been able to do yet, and perhaps it's something we'll look forward to and suggestions from people, is when we get into the financial health and comparing organizations, we haven't used a tool yet for the public sector. So the 3 sections that we have divided this results into, or these results into, are understanding the highly volatile and increasingly complex world an environment that CEOs are operating in, how they are standing out or coping in that complex world, and what they're doing to seize and take advantage of the complexity that in fact's in front of them. And I think we heard some of the comments in our previous speakers about how public sector should be taking advantage of these complex opportunities coming ahead. So let's take a first gander at the complex environment that CEOs are looking at and they're feeling about this. You'll note a very large response on the rapidly developing markets gaining economic power. So a real feeling around the globalization that we talked about from CEOs and the impact that's having. Now you may look at that in terms and say, well, that's, a private sector issue for markets and selling. Absolutely not. My experience in working with government is that this is a major factor in how governments are dealing with the economic issues they're dealing with, even simple questions about where the work of our government should be done. Not only private sector organizations are moving their work to other countries, now public sector organizations are looking at that, in many cases are doing that in order to save money. And those are big complex questions that need to be asked. The approach that we have here is the first bar is the full sample, so that's the global sample. The second bar is the Canadian sample. I think what you see from this slide is that Canadians overall are not out of line with the thinking of the rest of the globe in terms of three things: the rapidly developing markets and the impact of those, the big government, heavier regulation, and the continued globalization. I think this next analysis provides some very interesting differences in Canada, and it relates to some of the facts that I heard in our previous discussions around people and the requirements and gaps around people skills. The top 4 areas here are the ones that were identified by global CEOs as a group as the most significant forces that they're going to be dealing with in the next 3 years. Number 1, they said, was market factors. 2 was technological factors, followed by macroeconomic factors and people skills. But when we pull out the Canadian results, guess which one goes to the top? People skills. So whether that's a factor related to the large proportion that was government and some of the concerns we've heard about government in the gap in people skills, or whether that's our focus on our baby boom in general in Canada, or just where we're at in our evolution as organizations overall. But people skills was pointed out as the highest factor for the Canadians, and they saw technological factors as lower down on the scale at about a 35% factor. A couple of other differences that we noticed in terms of the new economic environment. While the full sample also saw volatility as high, the Canadian group were even stronger on this, so a high concern about volatility. Again, our Canadian marketplace and our high orientation to export or understanding of the global marketplace and the volatility that's creating for us. And even more uncertainty and less predictability than the rest of the globe is seeing. So Canada feeling very whipsawed by these things and feeling the impact on the environment that we're operating on. So 76% in Canadians concerned on the uncertainty versus 65 in the full sample. Structurally different, however, Canadians did not see as much change on the structural side. This may be something that we need to be thinking about from the public sector. As you recall, we've got a high percentage of our Canadian sample being public sector, almost 50%, and only 33% seeing the structurally different, where our global sample is over 50% on the structurally different. Does that say that we're not thinking enough about that as a public sector? Or does it say we're in a different mode and we are not looking for the same kind of changes structurally? Interesting questions there. In terms of transformation and what significant transformations we are going to see in terms of the information explosion. A couple of things to point out here, the Canadian being the light blue, second bar, is that while it was fairly common on industry transformation, information explosion, even stronger on the Canadian side. So we're looking at the impact of that information explosion. Highlighting again the talent shortages, if you look a little farther down there, the continuing Canadian concern on talent shortages showing up there. One that's a little bit interesting, however, is on the shifts between the markets. And the Canadians not seeing the same shifts between mature and relatively and rapidly developing markets on the same basis. Again, not sure what's bringing that out. Could be our Canadian orientation towards trade and already an external orientation, or is it naivety on the part of Canadians and we're not there yet? Interesting for interpretation, and some of you may have some insights to that. The shift between global and local markets, again, if you look at the bottom there, are we more insular in our thinking, or are we already out there because we're, as Canadians, we have tended to look to global markets as well overall? I think the next two slides are a very interesting sum up of the complexity of what the CEOs were seeing in terms of our future environment. What we assessed here was the level of complexity that you're currently experiencing and the expected level of complexity that you're going to be dealing with over the next 5 years. The global sample, the two bars at the top, saw increased complexity, so a 30% factor in terms of, yes, we've got complexity now, but boy, over the next 5 years, it's going to get even more complex. Notice the Canadians, even greater concern about that. So a big, almost a 50% concern about the increasing complexity that we're going to be seeing in our markets and in our business. But here's where the rubber really hits the road. When we look at how well we feel in terms of our preparedness to deal with that complexity. So the first bar looks at the expected level of complexity over the next 5 years. The second bar asks the CEOs, how well prepared do you feel you are or your organization is to deal with this complexity? And there's quite a gap. The gap overall at the global level is about 30%, even greater in Canada, just shy of the 50% mark. So real concerns, again, some of that may relate back to our people skills. It may relate back to our ability to cope in the global markets, but a real concern and a real gap in terms of our preparedness. The next section that we looked at is about standing out in a complex world. So one of the things we do in our analysis is to try and take the high-performing organizations. So this is the point where there's a little bit of divergence from the public sector in terms of our results, because we focus on what are referred to as the standout organizations. This is defined at this point by private sector. So they are organizations that on the matrix here have had outstanding long-term performance and outstanding short-term performance. So it was a financial measure of the performance of organizations both in the long term and the short term. To be in the upper quadrant, you needed to have both strong short-term and long-term performance. And again, something we've talked about in public sector, the need for both short-term and long-term vision and focus. So we took those standout groups and we assessed the 6% of organizations that fell into those two criteria for being standout organizations. And then the next thing we did was to look at how those organizations performed relative to organizations as a whole in the sample. And there's three things that we found were key to the success or the common themes that emerged from those standout organizations. The first was around embodying creative leadership. The second around reinventing customer relationships or citizen relationships, if we interpret that in the public sector mode. And the third was building operational dexterity. And again, a theme I heard emerge several times this morning in terms of how we are more flexible and more responsive in our organizational operations and structure. So I'm going to take a few minutes to look first at the creative leadership one as the number one leadership area that was identified by the standard organizations. So the top 3 leadership qualities that were identified over the next 5 years as being the key ones needed by organizations for this full sample: creativity, integrity, and global thinking. Not a lot different in the top 2, although I think I'm personally kind of proud to see the Canadians have integrity as their number 1 issue. I think that says a lot about the way we are in Canada, but we also recognize very strongly the creativity. Those two are in fact almost equally balanced. The third one, a little bit different, influence. Again, this may be a factor of our public sector component of the survey, saying the importance that influence was going to be. Influence in our political environment locally, but I would also argue influence globally and our influence in being able to drive our direction within the world. This next slide is just a wordogram which takes the quotes that we received from the CEOs and through a computing exercise made the frequency of mentioning of key words into a diagram here. And again, as you see, we see integrity as one of the highest frequently terms that was seen. And I think, again, in public sector, I'd be interested to hear some debate later on about that whole role in public sector and the importance of integrity and whether we have it, whether we're able to maintain it, and how we do in this evolving environment in the new social media world. Creativity, another very strong theme that emerged, and influence. So let's take a look at how these standouts performed. One of the things we asked them about in terms of what you would be doing to deal with this complex environment was how you would be dealing with strategy. And what we found was that the standout organizations versus the whole sample and the standout organizations versus the Canadian sample, so the Canadian sample is the one on the right-hand side of the screen, showed that they were much more inclined to be looking at a different approach to strategy. And that was a much more iterative approach to strategy as opposed to a set a strategy, freeze it, and then operate on that. Much more iterative in their thinking, being much more flexible, much more responsive, working with the latest information, the volume of data, and moving on with that. You'll also notice that our Canadian sectors here are highlighted here in the public sector. In Canada, only 43% versus the standouts at 74%. Again, something we need to talk about in terms of, do we need more flexibility, more responsiveness in our strategy and strategic approaches in the public sector. One thing we also found was that standouts focus on quick decisions despite uncertainty. So living in ambiguity, not waiting till they have all the data, the final data, but being able to make decisions and with fairly rapid fire process. So we found that overall, the standouts much stronger in this area, and you'll note the Canadians, quite a gap. So we're great at committees in Canada, I think we all know about that, but are we dithering too much? Do we need to move on to more rapid decision making? We're great at consultation, something I think we all pride ourselves in, but do we move from the consultation into the actual dimension of making change and doing something with that consultation. And again, interesting potential discussions on how we go about and modify that process going ahead. Another area is leadership styles, and standouts tend to leap ahead more in leadership styles with balanced communication approaches, focused on the continuous change versus ad hoc initiatives. So really a much more built-in continuous change. Continuous change doesn't mean just jumping to the latest flavor of the month and flipping back and forth. It's actually a continuous process that needs to be very formal and very understood, working on the analytics, working on the feedback mechanism and process. Persuade and influence versus command and control, something very important for the public sector, and understanding, and some of the transitions I heard Andrew and Peter talking about that the public sector needed to look at. And managed viral communication. There's another big one we were talking about. How do you get into the world from the command and control and the top-down communication into the one of managed viral communications? And what we're finding and need to learn from the private sector on this is those private sector organizations that are being successful at a global level, that are leaping ahead, are mastering these things. They're mastering continuous change in a formalized way. They're mastering persuade and influence, and they're mastering the world of viral communications or our social network media. There was also some discussion from Peter and Andrew on the whole restructuring side of things and changes to organization and governance. And again, here is another area where we see standout leaders being more willing to make change in how they go about that. Again, another message for our public sector, a lesson to be learned from those standout organizations. And finally, the areas that the standout organizations see as areas that they are making change, a willingness to make change, are on the enterprise model, their industry model, and their revenue model. And again, I think while these are private sector organizations, it doesn't take too much to translate those into the private sector. What are our revenue models? What are our taxation models? How do we organize as enterprises? I heard Peter and Andrew talk about some of those things in terms of different models coming up for the short term versus the long term. And what is our overall governance model that we're going to work at? So some interesting things in how the standout organizations are thinking about dealing with complexity. I'll leave these. These are just some of the questions, and I'm sure you've got lots of your good questions that you can ask, but these slides will be, I'm sure, made available, and you can ponder some of those questions that we asked there. Let me move on to reinventing customer relationships. And again, I would encourage you to think about this in the public sector mode from the citizen relationships, although, of course, many of the things that we do as government does involve something closer to the customer relationship, where we're issuing permits, we're issuing all sorts of licensing and various payments and activities that happen government to citizen. The first thing that we talked about here is about getting closer to the client. And again, you're going to find that this is a key thing with standout organizations, that they really focus on getting closer to their client. In the case of public sector, that would be getting closer to your citizen. They understand that to do this is what's going to give them the feedback mechanism, is going to get them closer to that client of one, that customer of one, that citizen of one, and using the analytics and information to be able to do that. And I heard some excellent examples of that niche situation in social services, of looking at the individual and focusing programs. Also talking about that in healthcare, what we're hoping Watson is going to be part of in his analytics is getting into the areas of even one-on-one medicine, not just your diagnosis, but actually working with your DNA, working with your individual situation, and medicine defined directly on a one-to-one basis. CEOs want to better understand, these standout organizations want to better understand the client needs and how to actively work with them. One of the things we learned, and some interesting differences here between The full sample in Canada, I think, is on what the CEOs are doing with these things, particularly those in the successful organization. We already talked about the better understanding of needs. So we all agree on that. Canada and the world on that one, we all agree. But new or different services, bit more of a gap there in Canada. Again, think about that from the public sector. Yes, we have a lot of things to do, but do we need to be thinking about the different things? And at the beginning of the talk this morning, we were talking about what is the role of government and what are those services that we're providing. Also, in terms of the stronger focus on the price-value equation. And this is one that I think is particularly disturbing and one that we really have to get on top of from an economic perspective and from a citizen satisfaction perspective, is really doing a better job on the price-value equation. And that's further emphasized here, I think, when we go and look at the standout organizations. So again, looking at those private sector standout organizations and their focus on the price-value equation versus what our Canadian sample said was their focus on the price-value equation is frankly a huge gap in terms of what we're going to need to do to be successful and to model after some of these organizations. So the information explosion is something that these successful standout organizations are really focused on. They see the impact on the organization of the information explosion as very critical to their success. They mine it. They use that complexity, the analysis of that complexity, to be successful as organizations and to better serve their clients. Something we should be looking at in public sector. How do we better serve overall by focusing on that data, mining that data, that information? Now, of course, this can also create a debate in public sector around privacy of information and how we manage that. A debate I'm sure that could take a whole day that goes on, but something we're going to have to wrestle with, and we're going to have to figure out ways to get through in order to be able to be successful in the value for money that we're delivering as public sector organizations. Again, some interesting questions on the whole customer or citizen relationship area for you to ponder on for your own organizations. Let me move on to the last area, which is that of building operational dexterity. And this is the flexibility and the quick responsiveness in organizations. What we learned was that in the change to operating strategy towards simplification was one of the key things for standout organizations. I liken this in my own organization, and I find myself talking constantly to my team about focus, focus, focus. One of the real challenges we have in this complexity, one of the real challenges we have because of all of the data and all of the information is the ability to not sort through it and focus on the key things and getting lost in that complexity. And what we're seeing is that the best organizations, so standout organizations, are able to take that data and not get lost in it, but be able to use it to focus on some of the most simple things, such as a Pareto principle of what are the key things that we need to focus on to be successful, to drive the agenda that we have or the outcome that we're looking for as an organization. And once again, if we look at the Canadian public sector compared to the standouts, 34% versus the 53%. Big gap there that we need to be looking at in terms of the focus and operational strategy. One that frustrates public sector all the time, of course, is execution speed. We talked about the 6 months to plan, and then the 6 months present an idea, and then try and get something done, and then another election. But something that we clearly have to tackle. And again, the standout organizations, it's their ability to get in front of those trends, get in front of that information, feedback that they're receiving from their customers, from their clients, from the market, from the macroeconomy, from the global economy, and make the decisions and get to the execution speed. And we have a very large gap there that we need to be thinking about from a Canadian perspective. We found that the standout organizations were also more focused on global integration, where Canadian CEOs were not as focused on that. Now, again, as I reminded you, this has got a large component, almost 50% of public sector in it. But, having done some of these interviews myself with the public sector in the province of Ontario, I'm not sure this is something that we as a public sector are thinking about enough in terms of that global integration. Now, in fairness, at the time we were doing this, we were in the middle of an economic crisis in Canada, and there was a lot of focus on our local employment, our local economics in terms of our budgets, etc. But I think we all know that those were derived from very much a global situation that was going on, and it tells us even more that we need to be focused on that. And again, a question about how this fits into government, but flexibility in terms of variability of costs. So not setting up a high level of fixed costs, but having more variability is something that we found the standout CEOs and the more successful CEO organizations were able to do. This was what allowed them a lot of their dexterity, was they weren't focused on the bricks and mortar. They didn't get into high levels of capital costs that could not be moved around and be flexible. And again, something private sector may be able to present as a model or think about in public sector. Obviously harder to do in public sector, but something we need to pull farther along in the direction of if we're going to be able to get more value and be more responsive for our tax dollars. Last area here, maybe not one quite as applicable, but interesting nonetheless in terms of the speed and dexterity are what creates the revenue growth from new sources. So our successful private sector organizations, this dexterity allows them to move quickly to places where they can see more revenue, they can see more opportunity for markets for growth to satisfy their citizens and their consumers. If you put this in a public sector context, I think you can also think of it as not just from the revenue side, but also from the cost side, and where we see the demand and the ability need to move quickly to solve the problems very quickly that come up more rapidly in organizations. And again, a few questions that you may want to look at and think about in terms of your organization. So if I just sum up here, we have a matrix that we've used to summarize overall the things to think about from our Capitalizing on Complexity survey. And that is on the vertical of our matrix, the 3 key factors that we learned: embodying creative leadership, reinventing customer relationships, getting closer to those customers, understanding more about them, and building on operational dexterity are the things that the successful organizations are doing well. In order to do that within the economic environment, it's handling the uncertainty, dealing with the volatility, and then moving to leverage the complexity. So seeing that as a great opportunity for organizations. So I think that sums up the survey. I hope that's helpful to you. It is going to be available, and I'm happy to follow up. If any of you would like to have a talk with one of your own organizations, we have people available to come and speak within smaller groups within the public sector about the results of this, and we're very happy to do that because we sincerely appreciate all of the participation that we did have from the public sector in Ontario and across Canada. I'm just going to introduce something for you before I leave the stage. This happens to be the centennial year for IBM. It's the 100th anniversary of IBM as an organization. And we are doing a number of things. The Watson video in Jeopardy is one of the pretty exciting things that we're going to be able to do for our 100th anniversary. We're also going to be doing a lot of work in Give Back and for charitable organizations. So I would like to let you know that I'm leading a team here in Toronto that is going to be making the capabilities of IBMers available to work in large teams or in small teams to charitable organizations. So if you have, we're currently searching for charitable organizations that we may be able to help with the manpower and woman power of our organization. So if you have a suggested organization you'd like to talk to me or us about, I encourage you to do that. And through the materials, you should be able to find my contact, or just contact through the organization and they can connect with me. And I'd be very happy to hear about any of those ideas.